like treating a medical patient as my wife Sonia does. Each economic crisis has its own characteristics, and one has to address them in a particular way. When I was working in Bolivia, which is now 40 years ago, actually 40 years ago this year, the inflation had reached 24,000%. When you reach 24,000% inflation in a year, you need some decisive measures. And in that case, recommendations that I made that the government accepted ended the hyperinflation immediately in the fall of 1985. Thereafter, in order to sustain that progress, I made other recommendations that at the time were somewhat unusual. For example, canceling almost all of Bolivia's debts so that it could get a fresh start. In other circumstances, you need other kinds of approaches. When the crises came in Eastern Europe in 1989 to 91, I helped governments introduce new currencies. In the case of Estonia and Slovenia, in the case of Poland, I helped to design a strategy for Poland to restore economic growth after really decades of crisis. And fortunately, it worked. In cases in Africa, as you mentioned, working with Bono and others, the crisis was a crisis of disease, how to address the crises of AIDS, TB, and malaria. And I recommended in 2000, when I worked with Secretary General Kofi Annan, the idea of a new global fund that could fight these diseases. And of course, then Secretary General Kofi Annan championed that idea, took it to world leaders. It became the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria. It's credited with saving tens of millions of lives. I'm very proud of that. It's one of the recommendations that I've made that was accepted, adopted, demonstrated, and I'm very proud of the results of that. So I found early on, as I watched my wife save children, she's a pediatrician, that each case requires its own diagnosis, its own analysis, its own understanding of the context. In medicine, that's called a differential diagnosis. In 2005, when I wrote a book called The End of Poverty, I coined the phrase clinical economics. I want economists to be as good as doctors. So if a doctor takes the history of the patient, I want an economist to understand the history, the culture, the society, the context, the nature of the crisis. I believe that with these tools, it's possible to solve problems, solve very important problems. And today we face innumerable problems, whether it's the climate crisis or other environmental crises or the continued existence of extreme poverty or hunger in different parts of the world. These require analysis and then a creative approach. And then, if we can do it, to get the world, the major governments behind such approaches and actually implement solutions. So this is more or less the story of how I viewed what I've been doing for the last 40 years.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned the Global Fund. In 2004, I was working with UNICEF in Somalia as the deputy representative, and we became the principal recipient for the Global Funds to tackle HIV and malaria. What a profound difference it made. That was the first time that the Global Fund said, let's also go into places which are in emergency zones.
It's wonderful to hear that link. And I can tell you, as I know you know very well, when I proposed the Global Fund, there were countless opponents that said, this can't work.
Yeah.
Oh, Somalia, they could never do this. Anytime you propose something, 1,000 people will stand up and say, that's impossible, that's a dream, that won't work, that can't be done. There were so many explanations of why it would not be possible to treat people in Africa with AIDS, for example. So many claims made why it would not be possible to treat people with malaria. Interestingly, the fund went forward, but it faced lots of opponents, of people who should have known better. And during those years when you were fighting disease in Somalia, I was fighting a basic point, which was that governments, including the United States government and many in Europe, were insisting that poor people should pay a certain amount for some of these medicines or these bed nets and so forth, that were the anti-malaria bed nets. And as late as 2007, when I was trying to convince the governments, for poor people, let them have these things. They will use them right. You'll save lives. I went to a meeting in Tanzania, and the donor community tried to boycott the meeting. They sent an email all around, don't go. Sachs is coming, don't go to the meeting. But by mistake, they included me on the CC list of the email. So I was able to write to all of them and say, oh, please join me. We're going to have a good discussion. But the upshot of that is that we had a new incoming Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon. I was profoundly privileged and honored that he asked me to advise him on these issues. And I recommended to him in his first days that the free distribution of the bed nets and other life-saving measures should be a hallmark of the UN. He's a very wonderful, remarkable person, and he immediately made a statement that it's time for us to make a major step forward in access to these life-saving means. And he changed the whole UN system by that statement. WHO, the World Health Organization, immediately said, yes, we will go for free distribution of the bed nets. And hundreds of millions of bed nets were distributed in the following 2 or 3 years thanks to what he did. And the result was a dramatic decline of malaria deaths and malaria disease. It was a stunning proof of what can be done when you have leadership like Ban Ki-moon, when you have clarity, when you have the technology. It all came together.
And a vision of yours, Jeff. Had it not been for you, this may not have happened, because I've seen firsthand the impact these bed nets have had on the lives of women and children, not just in Somalia, in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Darfur at the height of a conflict, how a simple bed net has so much of as a multiplier effect on wellness and well-being.
I appreciate you saying it. I can tell you a story that between 2000 and 2007, I was nonstop pushing for, give the nets for free, for heaven's sake. These are poor people. And Sonia can testify that we were at actually it was a World Economic Forum meeting, to tell the truth. And they called me to stand up and to say something. And somebody at the table of my wife said to another guest, but my wife heard it, oh my God, now we're going to hear about bed nets. And so during those years, I was saying it every time my mouth opened, give the bed nets. And finally the breakthrough came because of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and the results were remarkable. And we need to learn the lessons. We can do things in this world. We can solve problems. We can end hyperinflations. We can help countries get started after major crises. But it takes the desire to solve the problems. It takes the analytical approach to ask what seriously can be done. And then inevitably, it requires some investment. It requires some money. It requires some spending. And if we don't put all of those pieces together, the ethics that you care, the analytics of what to do, the financing of getting it done, well, then unfortunately we dream but don't solve the problems. But when we put the three together, we really can solve one problem after another.
Absolutely. So, Jeff, that brings me to a very important point, which is the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued a clarion call on rescuing the Sustainable Development Goals, where we are at approximately 17% implementation rates. The world is experiencing a polycrisis of sorts, the first that we've ever seen post the Second World War. In these circumstances, and as a United Nations champion for the Sustainable Development Goals, is there hope where should we double down to make sure that this one collaboration of 17 goals where the entire world came together to agree that yes, we must achieve these goals. Where do you see hope? Where should we double down? What can be done to make sure we can get the Sustainable Development Goals back on track?
The hope starts with the fact that unanimously in September 2015, in fact, it was September 25, 2015, with Ban Ki-moon presiding, with the Pope Francis giving the opening remarks at the UN General Assembly, all 193 world leaders agreed to the Sustainable Development Goals. Why? Because these goals express deep aspirations that are shared around the world. Four basic ideas: that everybody should have a basic economic standard for their dignity and for their well-being. Second, that we should have social justice, that no groups, not women, not minority groups, not religious minorities, not racial minorities, should be left out of the story. As we say at the UN, leave no one behind. Third, that we have an environmental crisis that is unique in human history. It was, after all, only because we are so economically productive, so much output in the world, so much economic activity, so many people, 8 billion people, that we also have the scale of activity that can really perturb the planet. 1,000 years ago, who could think that humans could wreck the oceans one way or another? Of course, it was impossible. Now we can really do this, unfortunately. So we have this unprecedented crisis that some politicians don't get. Some people don't understand. It's never happened before in human history this way. And sad to say, we have wars everywhere, which are fundamental impediments to accomplishing anything else, and also dangers to our very survival. And that's why in the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 16 is for peaceful and inclusive societies, and SDG 17 is for global partnerships. And so this is very basic yearning of humanity. These are not fancy goals that somebody dreamt up. These are expressions of what the world wants, what we need to achieve for our basic well-being, even for our survival. So that's actually the basis of hope, because the world came together, really decided on these things. A second reason for hope is, as I said earlier, if you analyze these goals, and that's what I do for a living, and that's what I've done for 30 years with sustainable development, these are big, bold, ambitious, but achievable objectives. So this is a wonderful, wonderful point. We can actually ensure that everybody has access to electricity. We have microgrids now that were unimaginable before. Everybody with a bit of effort could have access to the digital world. Certainly we can produce enough food on this planet for everybody. We already do so in the aggregate, but not in how the food is actually harvested, used, and distributed because of the inequalities in the world. Goal after goal is absolutely practicable, but we are not achieving the goals. And we're not achieving the goals, sad to say, and to put it bluntly, because we don't have the high-level political commitment to implement the practical solutions and to finance them. This wouldn't break the bank, but it's not for free. This is hundreds of billions of dollars, but we're in a $100 trillion plus world economy. We're talking maybe 1 or 2 percentage points of world output that should be shifted to ensure that all of the developing countries can have the kids in school, can have access to basic technological needs, can build the infrastructure that they need. This is what our task is. Now, even being, I hope not politically out of line, but I have to say it because it's my own country, the U.S. is not pulling its weight in this, and this is just an absolute fact. One way to see this, which is a little bit shocking, is that, as you know very well, countries are asked, governments that is, the members of the UN, are asked to present their Sustainable Development Goal plans to their peers. Every summer in July at UN headquarters, we have the high-level political forum in which countries present what are called their voluntary national reviews, VNRs. Some governments have done it 3 times, 4 times. Almost every country in the world has presented at least one voluntary national review. I'm sorry to say that there are 3 countries right now, 3 out of 193 that have yet to do so. Haiti and Myanmar, conflict, war, violence. The United States is the last one. The U.S. has not presented a voluntary national review. That was true from the Obama years to the first Trump administration to the Biden presidency and now the Trump presidency. It's even a little bit more dramatic because in a recent vote in the UN for something that was absolutely not controversial at all, it was a General Assembly resolution of the government of Bahrain for a day to celebrate peaceful coexistence. And in that document, in a not only non-objectionable way, but a very standard way, it reiterated the world's support for the Sustainable Development Goals. And the United States spokesman said, well, we can't support it because we don't support these goals. This is the current new government in the United States. All of this is to say, we have a real challenge right now. We have a very serious challenge of holding the world together, holding multilateralism together, making the United Nations work. We depend on the UN for our survival. We depend on the UN for our well-being. But we have to understand that we're under stress right now. And multilateralism is extraordinarily fragile. Interestingly, importantly, one of the reasons why multilateralism is so fragile is that our geopolitics has changed rather decisively. As many people have said, including the new U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, we are now in a multipolar world. That means that China is a great power, Russia is a great power, India is a great power, the United States is a great power, and so forth. And these great powers need to get along with each other. They need to say, we as very important countries of the world need to take up the responsibility together to ensure that the goals that the world is yearning for are actually achieved. This is not happening at the moment. It can happen. It needs to happen. It's extremely important.
Yeah. But, Jeff, just on that, I think the vision of Harry Truman and Roosevelt on when the United Nations came into being in 1945, I believe that vision has sustained, the charter has sustained, and it now needs much more effort by leaders across the world to keep it together. I mean, when I look at something like PEPFAR and the number of lives it saved from HIV, from the HIV pandemic across the countries that I worked in, I think the US continues to remain a beacon of hope for the advancement of multilateralism. And I've always said this, that the US and China together, that relationship is the most consequential relationship of the 21st century as we want to move the world forward in advancing human development, our humanity, the sustainable development goals, and a better future for all.
I couldn't agree more. PEPFAR is another case I had a bit of a hand in. And just to say that when George W. Bush Jr. became president on January 20th, 2001, I went to the White House almost immediately afterward because I was invited by the National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice. She asked me to brief her on the AIDS crisis. She reached out and invited me in. We were in the Situation Room of the White House, which is already gives you some little bit of goosebumps. And I gave a briefing to the National Security Council about the AIDS crisis. And at the end of it, I said the United States should have a program, $3 billion per year to fight AIDS. And interestingly, at the time, one of my former students was the economic advisor to the new administration. And he put his arm around my shoulder and led me out of the West Wing of the White House and said, Jeff, that was really good, but you don't stand a chance, really. And I said, you don't know. He said, no, Jeff. Anyway, you did a good job. 2 weeks later, Condoleezza Rice called me back, said, I'd like a second session on this.
Fantastic.
So I came back and again, and then President Bush said, we need to do this. This is good for America. And he understood it wasn't counting dollars. It was $3 billion. It's a lot for you and me, but it's not a lot for the United States. He understood that this would be something special, something dramatic. And so the U.S. launched PEPFAR. And when President Bush left office, he was asked, what's your proudest accomplishment? And he said, PEPFAR, actually. He said, we've saved a lot of lives. This was good for the United States. We need to keep that spirit. I think the American people have it. I think it's possible. You rightly mentioned that the United Nations itself was the brainchild of the President of the United States, of Franklin Roosevelt, during the war. He knew that we needed a new way to stop wars, prevent them, and end them. And he was determined. He didn't survive to the full fruition, but he brought it into existence. And the American people still overwhelmingly support the UN. We need our government to do the same. It serves the purpose of all of humanity, without question. And there's no way we're going to survive, actually, without it. This is a hard, literal truth. We need the nuclear arms control. We need agencies like the World Health Organization. We need what all of the UN family accomplishes. And it's so vital. It's fragile. I think we need, I would say, an upgrade given the added responsibilities that the UN needs to face, that only the UN can take on. I'm in favor of strengthening the UN in many, many ways, including new fiscal capacities. Right now, the UN has to beg from its own member states for the budgets. But actually, we need to fund all of these global activities on a far more systematic basis than we have in the past. We had a summit last year, Summit of the Future. It has several recommendations for strengthening the UN. We need to use that outcome to actually move forward now. And I believe that with leadership from China, with leadership from India, with leadership from the African Union, with leadership from Brazil, with leadership from countries around the world, Indonesia I could mention also, the call for a stronger UN will be heard, and it would be of inestimable benefit for humanity.